Hi everyone. In this lecture today we're going to talk about early modern art in China, sort of the arrival of modernism and wholly new kinds of ideas of government emerging out of the imperial past. To begin with, we have to talk about the end of the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire had really doubled down on Chinese traditions of the past and really rejected all of the Western ideas and was slowly being chipped away by Western incursions, Europe, United States coming in and sort of establishing missionaries and carving out ports and unequal treaties. And there was an uprising in the countryside whereby the Christian missionaries were creating a situation that was untenable to the locals, where people who were converted to Christianity were suddenly absolved of all debt to anyone else. And this was creating a horrific situation where people felt really cheated, and they lashed out in what became known in the West as the Boxer Rebellion. During this incident, 48 Catholic missionaries, 18,000 Chinese Catholics were murdered, and 222 Eastern Orthodox Christians were also murdered, 182 Protestant missionaries, and 500 Chinese Protestants. So there was this attack against Christians in China, and the Europeans who were the expats who were living in China all sort of came into the embassy compound in Beijing, and they were besieged on all sides for about a month before an international force could come and liberate them. During this incredible, tumultuous time, the Qing Empire was nominally in favor of the rebels winning and kicking out the foreigners. That was sort of their desired wish. At the same time, while they didn't overtly help them, they didn't come to the rescue of the Westerners. So at the end of the Boxer Rebellion, the Western powers just loaded on all kinds of problems to the country and asked for reparations for the damages to their missions and the deaths of the people inside their country. And this created an untenable situation, which eventually led to the overthrow of the Qing Empire and the abdication of the child emperor Puyi, and a new, more Western-oriented nationalist government emerged, really backed by very wealthy, powerful merchants within the country, and sort of maintaining a lot of this sort of power hierarchy that had been around for a long time underneath the emperor's court. So the effect of the Boxer Rebellion was rather humiliating and degrading, and yet there was a kind of also a sense of denial about what was going on at this time with the Westernization, and a kind of desperate attempt to sort of hold on to traditions of the past despite these oncoming incursions, Western art. One of the ways in which people had ideas about what was going on in the world, or within China at least, were these popular prints. And these were things, woodblock prints that would be carved and locally printed and disseminated for popular consumption. Here's an example of a sort of popular print depicting the Boxers versus the Red Lanterns, and this was the foreigners. In this particular version that was printed and sold, of course, in this case here, the Boxers, the fighters on the side of China, would defeat the Westerners. And so this kind of wishful thinking was part of a sort of continuing practice of sort of really not coming to terms with the tremendous changes that were happening elsewhere in the world. Popular publications, Nianhua, had been around for several centuries. And it wasn't until the 1890s that lithography would emerge. And with the arrival of lithography, a lot of these people were put out of business. So there's this enormous disruption. Woodblock prints that would be carved by the thousands of people. They could only generate a few hundred prints, and they would copy each other and move out and be very localized. But with lithography, you can suddenly make thousands of prints, and you can centralize the printer, and you can have enormous impact within a city, reaching a far larger population. So lithography is very kind of upsetting to this. This is a woodblock print. Here you see on the left. And if you can see, this was this Zhongkui, which is the image of the demon queller, who is a popular print that would appear during the New Year's celebrations. People would buy prints to decorate auspicious images and such as this, so that they could have a good year in the coming year. Other kinds of images that people employed had different ideas about westernization. Here we see women going to school in uniform. It's kind of, you still see them wearing bound feet. So there's a kind of a way in which they are both sort of adhering to this sort of traditional idea of a woman. At the same time, they're sporting rifles and conducting themselves as if they were sort of engaging in activities in the world. This is the golden age of the theater Beijing Opera, and the star Mei Lan Fang rose to great prominence during this period, and his celebrity would become worldwide. He made several world tours performing his famous roles, female roles. Mei Lan Fang was a man who specialized in this traditional way of performing. He was a person who really saw a very important way that Beijing opera needed to change in order to become relevant. And so he brought in a whole new range of possibilities for female characters. And then when the opportunity came later in his career, he taught his daughter to do the roles, and he encouraged women to become performers in Beijing opera, such that today women now play women's roles, and they owe that to pioneers such as Mei Lan Fang. There were prints, popular prints, that came out depicting actors performing stories, such that we saw in Japan. These are much simpler publications. There are quickly passed around. There are stories that they don't have the kind of individual performers and individual performances, that kind of information that we saw with the Japanese ukiyo-e. In this case here, the lian huanhua were used as a kind of primer to learn about the stories that were being performed nearby on the stages. Another very popular art that emerged at this time, painting, was changing under the influence of new ideas about art. Qi Bai Shi was a really remarkable self-taught artist who left the farm, taught himself how to paint, and just really had this sort of freshness and a new kind of vigor to his work that people found very refreshing. And despite all the great tumult and chaos of this century, Qi Bai Shi has seemed to emerge unscathed with this incredible vigor and life to his paintings. In 1962, he was posthumously named one of the 10 great cultural giants of China. Here you can see his really wonderful, quick, energetic brushwork, a series of shrimp kind of falling down the page. Another artist who proved very popular at this time and continues to be very popular is Xu Beihong. He spent 8 years abroad, and so he was really much more schooled in the tastes and ideas of Western art, and he sort of brought this idea of horse movement and sort of the idea of horses in action into his work to create this really vigorous and wonderful painting style, which really accentuates this movement in the brushwork. In 1936, he created a work, The Eagle in the Pine Tree, that was sold in the U.S. for $2 million. So he'd become quite a celebrated artist today. Chinese culture came to confront the Western world in a very powerful way with the May 4th movement in 1919. This is the end of World War I. At the Versailles Treaty, both China and Japan fought against the German holdings inside China. And it was understood that China would have returned to it its own holdings. The territory the Germans had captured would be returned to China. And instead it was given to Japan. And this was such a humiliation. It created such an outcry and an anger that there was such a sense of betrayal that they felt that there needed to be a more aggressive and more militant resistance to the culture of the West. How to create a new kind of world. And so the schism really creates a more radicalized socialist communist party and a nationalist party, which was more based on the kind of Western parliamentary democracies that had been in Europe at this time. And the nationalists and the communists did not get along, and they were constantly at war with each other. But very soon they would have a very common enemy in the Japanese in World War II. During these interwar years, as the cities were developing, people began to try and find more progressive ideas about art. The Storm Society, which thrived during this time in the city, they promoted some of these ideas, both nationalist and communist parties, this idea of realism, and trying moving away from the sort of fanciful and idealized forms in Chinese painting, and to try and create pictures that really reflected what was happening in the cities at this time. They were looking at Cubism, they were looking at surrealism, and other kinds of ways in which they could directly address the way people lived today. So this is Pang Xunqin, The Riddle of Life, from 1930. You can see how he is using different ideas of text in the picture, portraits, figurative work, architecture, jumbled up in this way that really is very reminiscent of the kind of experimentation that was happening in the Cubists. Militancy and political art was something that became a very important idea to communicate this sense of frustration and anger against the nationalist government. There was new work that was created that was clearly modeled on Western protest art at this time. Here, Hu Yichuan, To the Front, woodblock print from 1932. We see an angry mob rushing to the front. showing people to take arms and take action, to strike and protest against the nationalist government. These kinds of images were clearly drawn from the sort of woodblock print art that was happening in Europe at this time. Käthe Kollwitz and her expressionist art, or Franz Masriel and his kind of socialist ideology in his woodblock prints, that stories that he created. These were very powerful and iconic artists that were widely circulated within the communist and socialist parties, and they would have been familiar with these ideas. You can see this approach. Of course, woodblock prints are very old in China, and they were associated with the ideas of the working class and the lower class people. So it seemed like the right thing to do is to go back and reinvigorate the idea of the woodblock print, with the sense of the struggle, with the idea of poverty. You can see these images that were made to try and provoke a sense of anger and frustration in the conditions that were happening in China at this time. Another important artist was Feng Zikai, and he was a painter who went to Japan during this time, and he was really taken by the way the Japanese had sort of reinvigorated their own traditional art. They had become interested again in their own painting techniques with this new style of comical drawings they called manga. Now, Feng Zikai knew that the word manga in Japan was actually based on a Chinese word, manhua. And so he decided to call his own sort of editorial cartoons manhua. They were poetic, they were lyrical, they had these sort of quick brush strokes and gestural line work, but they also had this underlying feeling of something modern, something in the moment, something spontaneous. And so we see in his depiction here a young girl with a jade hair clasp and a dragonfly sort of hovering right behind her head. This rather lovely image was one of the first that he had published in this literary magazine. So this would have been something that would have really appealed to people who were among the sort of literary elite in Shanghai, where all this sort of modern ideas are going. So Feng Zikai's manhua began published. As the war broke out, Feng Zikai's manhua became much darker, and he began to record the atrocities in the city and the horrible, horrible conditions that occurred during the Japanese occupation of Shanghai. Another cartoon artist who couldn't get published at this time because his work was too satirical to the ruling nationalist government, he actually decided to create an exhibition, and he rented out a hall and he posted his work on the walls, and thousands of people came to see his work, The Cat Kingdom, in 1946. This work was a kind of series of satirical images showing the corruption of the government. The cats who were supposed to protect the people, the mice, were paying bribes to keep the sort of corrupt cat government in power. It sort of didn't directly implicate the nationalists, but it did make it abundantly clear that the people who were supposed to protect us were actually allowing the country to be robbed. So the nationalists attacked the communists and pushed them down into a small enclave in the south of China, surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. They were losing a war by attrition. Eventually, a bold plan emerged that they would escape, head directly west into the wilderness and evade the nationalist forces, and then recamp far in the north. This enormous journey was somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 miles long. They covered 18 major mountain ranges in a little more than a year. That meant about 22 miles a day. The fleeing 90,000 army was reduced to a mere 8,000 soldiers. Okay, this is a staggering defeat. And the idea, the person sort of driving this on was a young leader in the Communist Party known as Mao Zedong, and we'll talk more about him. Here we can see the soldiers of the Long March on their journey. During the retreat, the membership of the party fell from 300,000 to a mere 40,000. Now, this would have been a kind of devastating defeat to almost anyone. But Mao Zedong was a kind of master of self-promotion and survival, and he took this incredible failure as a kind of victory. And here we see Mao Zedong's own calligraphy, where he writes, "Making light 10,000 crags and torrents, the three armies marched on, each face glowing." And so he gives this kind of sense of, valor and purpose to this retreat that really didn't exist. There are all kinds of horrific stories from this time of the incredible sacrifices that people made for Mao Zedong. And we really don't know the full extent of the truth of the matter because, of course, the history has been written and maintained by the Communist Party. So the Communist Party, what remains of it, is decamped now in the sort of northwest region called Yunnan. And there they are trying to figure out how they can regroup and redirect their efforts. They know that they need to re-engage and refight the battle. Now, the problem is, right now, the Japanese have occupied the country and the nationalists have been defeated and or co-opted by the Japanese. So in this time when they're trying to regroup, Mao Zedong holds these talks on art and literature, and he's keenly aware of the importance of having good propaganda. And so he wants to reform the way in which the Chinese Communist Party really thinks about how they make images to convert the local populace to their values and their ideas. And he wrote, "What we demand is the unity of politics and art, a unity of content and form, the unity of revolutionary political content, and the highest possible perfection of artistic form." We know that Mao Zedong was an exceptional calligrapher. The example of calligraphy before, he promoted himself in this cultural way. He took great pride in calligraphy. He knew calligraphy had a kind of power to sway people, and he always insisted that the quality of the characters that were used in his propaganda were the highest and best made calligraphy, because he wanted to have this kind of integrity to the message. Here's a woodblock print that was promoted during Yan'an. It was a way to show the sort of hardworking virtues of of the Communist Party. Also this idea of equality of the sexes, that both men and women would both share in the victories of, and there wouldn't be this sort of Confucian hierarchy between male and female members. And so this poster celebrates brother and sister open wasteland and a sort of hard-working virtue. Now, the funny thing was, these kinds of posters, when shown to the local population, the villagers thought were very funny. There was a sort of veiled sexuality. Brother and sister open wasteland, when read in a certain context, meant, you know, husband and wife plowing the field. There's a kind of innuendo here that they thought was rather funny. And this was maybe another one of those sort of failed attempts to communicate. I bring this up because I think it was something that was a common criticism of the Communist Party at this time and even today, was that it was very chaste, and it sort of used images and ideas of folk art, but sort of extracted any of that sort of bawdy humor that was endemic to those traditions. Let me give some more examples. You'll see what I'm saying. Here we see in that earlier example, Hu Yichuan to the front, and we see this sort of strong, direct message, go protest. And this is what Mao wanted. He wanted something that was clear and direct, something that the people could get behind. But he rejected the idea that the art needed to be angry, and that it had to be something that would be a kind of directed toward a kind of overthrow. He said we really need to focus on creating art toward the positive. So let's look at Shen Quan. Here's an image, a traditional painting done in this elaborate style, and it is clearly directed towards something positive. It's very apolitical, though, and Mao would say that it is all about the status quo. It's about maintaining that sort of hierarchy of tastes and ideas that had been around for centuries. And so he rejected this idea that art needed to be sort of this sort of passive, something pretty to put on the wall. He said all art must be political. And if it's not directly political, it means that you sort of accept the status quo. So really what Mao was arguing for was a kind of unity that would bring together something that was overtly political with something that was decidedly positive. Here is another example of communist ideology in folk art. In the 1944 Yan'an Spring Festival, party officials had come up with this idea of converting a folk dance that was done during planting season called Yanga, and they went and sort of made it into this sort of Communist Party cheering the people dancing together. And so they took this sort of folk dance and they put it to this new communist ideology. This is, again, this way of using things that the villagers would have known and would have been familiar with, but then infusing them with this new communist ideology. Another thing they used, we talked about Lian Huanhua, these picture stories. It was decided that this was a way to communicate, again, to ordinary people, create these little booklets that people were familiar with, and create new stories that would talk about communist ideology and issues. So this new revolutionary Lian Huanhua was the way they would go about it. This was a format that people accepted, and they adopted the art style of this sort of more antique way of working, like a woodblock print. But it wasn't a woodblock. These were lithographic prints, but they wanted them to look like older woodblock prints with not a whole lot of modeling and sun and shading, but very clear, striking, graphic images that were very easy to read. Here, an early example of this revolutionary Lian Huanhua by Mi Gu. Erhe gets married. In this, we see a young couple who are rejecting their parents' advice and going off and getting married because they love each other. And so this was another thing that the Communist Party was sort of banking on, was that they could convert people to communism if they understood that overthrowing the social order would mean more freedom for such things as choosing your own mate. Intellectuals at this time really took to heart this idea of having a new national art, one that was based on the art of the people and really draw in the strength and character of traditional arts, but give them a new revolutionary purpose. Liu Xun was a very influential man who brought in a lot of people and brought a lot of the ideas about, reforming the woodblock print traditions. They have discarded the excellent traditions of ethnic line work that they mastered over many years and decades, and they insist on working with a technique of chiaroscuro, the Western shading, which they are not familiar, which is not easily mastered. So he's saying, why are we using shading when our work traditionally didn't use that? And so this becomes a kind of way of approaching the art so that it harkens back to this more striking graphic quality. You can see that in these revolutionary Lian Huanhua by Ding Bingqian and Han Heiping. The Railroad Guerrillas was published in 10 volumes between 1954 and 1962. The dramatic drawing and action-filled story had proved immensely popular in the decades following its first release. It was reprinted at least 36 times and sold almost 4 million copies. Okay, so the scale at which these picture stories were promoted is just staggering, and the artwork is incredibly beautiful. Look at the way in which the different line works. It feels like the brushwork is there, but again, this is a lithograph, but it's created in such a way that it harkens back to this earlier idea without the shading, just using the sort of graphic images. It wasn't just revolutionary stories about the here and now that were published at this time. This was also used to promote other more traditional stories. Here was Xiao Hongben and Qian Xiaodai, Monkey Beats White Bone Demon. And again, this image is a story from the Journey to the West, a very popular traditional story, which was a Beijing opera. And you can see this wonderful, very expressive, even kind of modernist image here, where we see the white bone demon, and she's sort of contemplating her situation, and you have this wonderful sort of patchwork of rocks and filigree, and in the background, the Monkey King is kind of peering into this cave. It's just a beautiful image. It's incredibly sophisticated, and it's a great testament to, even at this time, as the Communist Party was promoting this very strident ideological ideas, there was still a fair amount of variety in the messaging that was available for people to read.